Hello, everyone. Welcome to 1.5 Degrees, the podcast where together we explore the science, solutions, and stories involved in the fight against climate change. I'm your host, Heidi Pan, speaking with the professionals behind the latest research, policies, culture, and innovations shaping our response to global environmental challenges. For today's episode, we are joined by Katie Hoeberling, who is the Director of Policy Initiatives at the Open Environmental Data Project, and Emelia Williams, who is the Policy and Research Associate at OEDP, to discuss bridging gaps between communities, government, civil society, and science, the role of climate data in the protection of our environmental health, increasing data accessibility, and more. Thank you both so much for starting this climate conversation with me today. It's truly an honor.
Thanks for having us.
It's been a while since we've last spoken. I guess to start, I do want to ask for listeners who are not familiar with the OEDP, what is the mission of the Open Environmental Data Project and what are your roles in this work?
Yeah, so our mission, Open Environmental Data Project, or OEDP, is to create spaces where we bring together people from government agencies, from academia, from community organizations, from tech. It's a very multi-sectoral effort to come together and rethink and redesign our environmental data ecosystems. So that can manifest in lots of ways. Sometimes it means that we're gathering information and perspectives and writing briefs. Sometimes it means we're actually co-designing a tool together. But the idea is that with more information and data shared openly, but also ethically and responsibly, we can get to our environmental and climate justice goals. So we're really trying to center community perspectives and values, and bring people together with that kind of knowledge from local contexts into spaces where people from research communities and government can do things with that information and empower us to actually create real change. So that's kind of our overall mission, but yeah, we can talk a little bit more about what that actually looks like later.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you guys are part of the policy team. I would like to go into that for sure. But I guess also define some things. Can you guys, explain what exactly environmental data and data governance means and what role data plays in, environmental and climate governance?
Yeah, sure. I can talk about that a little bit. So we like to think about environmental data in many different forms. And so it can be, the CSV files of an air quality data set collected from a monitor. We can also think about photos that are taken by residents in a community that are maybe experiencing stormwater flooding issues. So it can be anything along this gamut from weather and climate data, air, water, soil quality data, satellite images, photographs, stories, art. There's everything kind of in that whole spectrum. And I think we like to think about environmental data really playing a role in governance in that it assists in representation and decision making. And so that can be, as evidence in regulation or in advocacy. I think a really good example that might illustrate that a little bit better is thinking about air quality monitoring data near refineries. And so that can be a tool for those fence-line communities that they can use, when and demonstrate when pollution reaches, a dangerous threshold or, ultimately, hopefully hold those companies accountable for, pollution sources and leaks. And then, yeah, I think that it can also help communities make their case when maybe regulation or policy hasn't been proposed or implemented. I'm thinking about examples of monitoring levels of PFAS chemicals in streams. In a case in New Hampshire where, they're trying to make this case for broader regulation on a state and local level, but also using that data to, do advocacy work with the, local media. So there's lots of different ways that data can be inserted into policy and digital tools that help communities represent, what's happening in their community and what's happening in the environment in their community.
Yeah, no, that's first of all, that's really awesome. And also it's just something that I think about when I first think of policy work is I don't really think about the kind of data that plays into that, but as you say, data is so important to, be able to, I guess, be accessed in terms of supporting that policy work that is, ultimately what affects people's lives and how they interact with the environment. And so that's really amazing. And so again, when I first think of policy work though, I don't really think about that aspect of like implementation. And I guess like what you guys do is it's not exactly like writing bills or lobbying, but what you guys do is more so with like advisory and on the implementation side of that. So I guess what does that work like for the two of you?
Yeah, that's spot on. And of course, writing bills and the actual language of legislation is really important for policy work. But you're right, there's this whole other side of policy work, which we tend to kind of sit on, which is, as you said, kind of implementation, and you might even say like interpretation. So you could take any policy on the books and it could be interpreted in many ways. That's why we have courts. But there are also a lot of policies either leave a lot of room intentionally or unintentionally for how they're actually carried out. So as an example, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, they're part of the White House, last year released a memorandum on mandating all federal agencies that are sharing research data and research to update their open access policies. But they didn't tell them how to actually do that. They didn't say these are the things that need to be included in those updated policies. It's just that they need to be done by the end of 2025, and all results and related data need to be public access. So there needs to be these lots and lots of agencies need to come up with this plan. So we are really interested in how that plays out in different agencies. So for example, the National Science Foundation is working on theirs right now. The National Institutes of Health is basically done, I believe. They were kind of ahead of the curve. And then there are regulatory agencies that may or may not be publishing research data. And so we think a lot about, first of all, this is maybe a little bit closer to that first side of policy that you mentioned, like the actual language that goes into those policies. So we do think about that a lot, and we bring together people to try to build consensus on what language actually could look like. So for example, we have a project called the Beyond Compliance Network, where we are, in a nutshell, trying to figure out how agencies like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, can share data in ways that are more usable to people outside of the EPA. And one thing that we're really excited about that this group is doing is actually coming up with that language that could be inserted into policies, or that community organizations and researchers could use to request data from those agencies. So that is a little bit of the kind of like language side of things. But even when you're writing those recommendations, you have to think about what is already in place. What data systems, what infrastructure is EPA already using, that isn't going to be obvious from looking at their policies that they publish, or that they use. What formats are they sharing data in? Is it a CSV or is it a PDF? And those have very different implications for how usable environmental data might be. So I guess what that means for us is that we're often kind of straddling that line where we're trying to understand how policies are being implemented, how that implementation is impacting communities and researchers and other people who want to use data, and then trying to figure out how we could change those systems for the better, either through new policy language, or maybe it could be even more simple than that, of just thinking about how data might be shared differently in different ways. So that's kind of a vague answer, but we're kind of like in the middle there, if that makes sense.
So what you mentioned or touched upon is like how honestly like the federal government, like when they come up with all of these like policies and identify what needs to be improved upon, they'll write the bills, but they also tend to be like like vague in terminology in terms of implementation. So that kind of stuff depends on agencies to do that kind of like individually, and so that definitely would look different for every agency, of course. And I'm sure that would look differently though across like different levels. And I know you guys work with local communities as well, obviously, in order to bridge that gap. So how do your, I guess, like recommendations differ across that kind of like community or state or federal level?
Yeah,
you want to
I can
take
talk
it,
a little
Amelia?
bit about this. Yeah. And maybe Katie, you can interject with more beyond compliance related stuff. But I think that at the state and federal levels, we're making a lot of recommendations that are addressing, both the structural, cultural, informational barriers to information systems, as well as building that capacity and also structuring funding opportunities that really increase access to data and making an open data, but also addressing equity. And I think that that can look like a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. Thinking about building capacity, it looks like, creating more roles for state and federal data officers, addressing critical digital infrastructures, but also investing in both creating, but also maintaining open data and open science systems. I think a lot of, government can also fall prey to what tech does, and that always want to create a new, system or hub or innovation, when really all you need is the maintenance of things that already exist or the improvement of things that already exist. So I think that's what we're looking at the state and federal levels. I think at the community level, I think we stray away from recommending things for communities to do, because I think honestly communities bear the burden of doing a lot of this collection work in the first place. But I think, at that community level, often recommending that there's an opportunity for intermediary organizations. So thinking about like community-based organizations or, research-focused organizations to really support these processes. So whether that looks like, looking at data workshops that help with advocacy and data literacy training, and really like making sure that those kind of crosswalks between government and communities are clear and willing and accessible for communities to really access what they need out of data and get what they want, and maximize that value out of their own data. Katie, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more to more state federal recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking we could talk a little bit more about state and federal, but I'm also thinking about how a lot of the recommendations and other policy work we do is about how those different levels of, I don't know if you want to call them governance, because communities do have governance, but they're not necessarily part of the formal government. But how those different levels interact with each other and how they might collaborate more effectively together. And so, as Amelia said, the onus is often on communities to figure out how to work within government systems. But so we are thinking a lot about how policy, whether or not that's language or whether it's implementation, can influence the way public agencies and researchers, for that matter, can collaborate in more equitable ways with communities and the public. So there's kind of like the recommendations for these different levels, and then how do we also work together? Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. I mean, it's like, because the thing is like, often, I mean, communities are already like they're collecting data, and it's just, but it's like they have to, and it's quite frustrating, right? It's like there's so many, like, I'm sure, legal barriers that they'd have to like go through. Communities are already doing this work, and it's just not being incorporated. So I guess like I do want to ask, why would that be the case? And like, why is it so often that data is so underutilized in regulatory, legal, and legislative processes, even though that's like, obviously very crucial?
Yeah, totally. I think that we wrote a paper, Shannon and I co-authored a paper last year that talks about kind of this overused, data information pipeline that, it might be assumed that data is collected and then just like neatly used in ways that make sense for the community and make sense for government. But I don't think that narrative really portrays the kind of convoluted pipeline that data takes to like be used in governmental settings. And so I think that we see issues with outdated data systems, and that, as we've said, that outdated data systems, working with those data systems is the burden that communities have to face, right? And there are issues, with collection and management and use. So thinking about metadata. So either metadata might not be collected, or is it collected with community participation? You can also think about like storage and management issues. So, if it's monitoring data that might be collected with a civil society or academic partner, maybe that's held in a way that doesn't prioritize action on community issues. So either that data is completely closed off to their use or completely open in ways that they're not comfortable with. So like thinking not really prioritizing privacy or protection concerns. And then there's often, monitoring data that's stored and maintained by government partners that data is really siloed and it lacks capacity to be accessed in ways that make sense. And it's unresponsive, So I'm thinking about like an example that came through on Data Dialogues, our podcast in the first season, where you could access a certain kind of transportation data, but you had to buy a CD from a specific, regulatory agency and like have a computer that could run a CD, right? That's not what most people have now. So it's just like one example of, data might be open and accessible, but that accessibility is varies wildly based on the agency and varies wildly based on how you want to use it. Katie, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I guess the other thing I would say is there are sometimes the policies that our government has in place makes it impossible to infeasible to actually incorporate community data. So there, even if there is an interest, which I think the EPA has been really good in the last couple of years about trying to figure out how they might use community data better and make some of their processes more participatory. So there's interest there, but they have, sometimes for good reason, and sometimes things are just outdated, but there are often policies that prevent them from doing it. So a specific example that I'm thinking of, OEDP works a little bit around open hardware, which, if you're not familiar, is open science can mean a lot of things, and open hardware is kind of, can be part of open science, and sometimes it's not related to science at all, but it's hardware tools. So in the environmental monitoring space, you can think of air quality sensors, water quality sensors, that kind of thing, that whose designs are shared openly so that anyone can access them and figure out how to build that tool on their own. The only limits would be access to the actual, materials used to make the tool. And they're usually almost always lower cost than something that is proprietary or not open. And there is interest in EPA in figuring out how we can encourage the use of open hardware tools, but it can be really difficult to fit the way that those tools collect data into EPA's quality control and assurance systems. So on one level, maybe they don't trust the data, and maybe that's something that is more cultural than anything. But on another level, the outdated policies make it impossible for them to, even if they did trust the data, for them to actually incorporate it into like a regulatory process. So there's things like that as well that can get really tricky. But movement, at least, we're working on it.
Yeah, no, I mean, no, that's good to hear that kind of how the data is like, I guess, like accessible is improving now. But that's also interesting that it's like, because I mean, regulation is important. You need to make sure that data is of, like, I guess, quality. I don't know what the correct term is. Yeah,
quality is right.
Yeah. No, but then if it's like outdated regulatory and it's a matter of like trust, which is that like subjective or whatnot, like that's kind of that could be definitely a barrier that's really interesting and frustrating, I'm sure, to work around. Because like you can say that something's accessible, but as you say, like if it's something that's like a CD that you need to purchase and then have to find all the like that's not easily accessible. This is already kind of touching on it. So like, what are the barriers facing collaborative environmental governance practices that like OEDP is actively working to bridge?
Yeah, so I think what I just mentioned with the open hardware, I think that's one of them. Even though within a sector, there's like, I'm thinking of academia and like formal, I guess, for lack of a better word, science. Even within a sector like that, there are a lot of barriers for collaboration between disciplines. So we definitely are of the belief that environmental science and environmental monitoring can't happen outside of human systems. Like there is always going to be a human element, and that's really important. But there are people who do environmental science who take social phenomena and data and qualitative approaches into consideration, but it's definitely not the norm. And vice versa. There are social scientists who consider environmental and maybe I don't want to say quantitative data, because there are a lot of quantitative social scientists, but the point is that it's really not the norm for those two kinds of disciplines to collaborate with each other. And I think I'm trying to think of how I would like organize what those barriers are. And I think there are this is probably not all of them, but I'm thinking of three different kinds of barriers. And there's culture, which we've talked about. And, culture is often reinforced by incentives. So, in academia, there might be limited, if any, incentives for you to collaborate with others. Like you publish the most and you get cited the most if you're doing things within your lane. And another one is infrastructure, which we've talked about a little bit as well. Like what can your digital tools, your hardware, what can they actually enable you to do? And if we definitely aren't of the opinion that technology can save us from everything, but it's a critical aspect of that system. And then the last one is capacity. So what have people been trained to do? What access to, educational, other kinds of professional development resources do people have access to? So that's definitely relevant for academia, but even in government, we've talked with a lot of folks who are very interested in collaborating with community organizations, or even, interested in using different kinds of data analysis practices, but don't have access to the kind of training that would enable them to kind of keep up with these new techniques, and would make it easier to adopt new technologies that are coming on, and making it easier for people to collaborate. So that's kind of how I'm organizing it in my mind. I wonder if, Emelia, if there are other kind of barriers that you're thinking of.
No, I think you hit on, I think separating it out into those categories really makes sense. And I think also just hitting on how each one of those barriers looks differently across like the collaboration spectrum, right? So like thinking about what those barriers look like for academia, what those barriers look like for philanthropy, what those barriers look like for local government. So I think you hit on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you separated those three barriers really well. I mean, it's like, obviously it's not, it's very complex, those barriers, and like, but I mean, it's so critical that everyone can, like, I guess, be able to work together, because you can't have policy without working with data. You can't have data without, like, policies for those data to go into. And I mean, in terms of like that barrier with academia, I often, like, I've come to realize that academia can at times be kind of like sort of an echo chamber, where it's just like published papers that just don't really go anywhere, which is really unfortunate, because that, there's critical insights there that can be utilized. So I mean, yeah, no, this is definitely a challenge. And so what you guys do is you kind of like, am I correct in understanding that you guys are kind of like the intermediary and in like making sure that these I guess like bubbles can intermingle with each other or like collaborate in some way?
Yeah, I think that's one role we play for sure. And maybe it'd be helpful for us to get a little bit more specific about what we actually do. But yeah, I think so. Hitting on the kind of academia aspect of this, we have a project right now that we're calling Seek Commons, and that stands for Socio-Environmental Knowledge Commons, that is trying to build curricular resources to help researchers and government staff, but mostly researchers, figure out how they can share data in ways that are going to be usable outside of their very specific project that is being funded right now. So thinking what we've called this kind of beyond original intent, also about thinking about how they can collaborate with community organizations and people at local levels from the beginning. So how do you design a study with a community rather than, collecting data and then maybe coming back at the end and doing engagement and saying, here's the data, and not necessarily being very helpful to them. Yeah, and I think maybe Amelia can talk to you a little bit about community data hubs, but I think they're the kind of intermediary aspect of what we do is how do we thinking about those kind of like three categories of capacity, infrastructure, and culture. What resources can we build? How can we bring people together to think about what those resources actually need to be, what they look like, and then how do we get them out into the world so that they're actually taken up, so we can kind of change culture, change infrastructure, etc.
Yeah. Just to add on that, I think, Katie's hitting on this important thing that, like, I feel like a lot of people always give me the feedback of, like, you all are in so many different, very niche communities, right? So, like, I think a lot of what OEDP does is somewhat like translate across these different kinds of sectors. And so, between the open source community, like the climate environmental justice community, maybe digital rights community. So, like, I think OEDP is usually like kind of at these intersections where it's good to have somebody who kind of can speak the different languages and bring those people together and address these barriers in a way that kind of hits upon, hopefully, the goal of hitting upon the needs and desires and incentives across those sectors.
Yeah, no, I guess, like, oh gosh, that was the word I was looking for, translation. Yeah, no, that's really awesome. And yeah, no, I guess, like, for Amelia, Katie had mentioned the community data hubs, which is an initiative that's super exciting. How do you hope the community data hubs would fill the gaps that existing models that we've kind of touched upon, like, I guess, like open government data platforms or public complaint or comment and complaint systems, like, there's gaps that those systems have, I guess, failed to address.
Yeah, totally. So I think that community data hubs provides a really interesting and complex kind of place to allow for these open practices to be modeled in a way that actually works for communities. And so it'll be kind of this prototyping and design space where we can address and promote and think about usable data, and instead of conversations that are purely about open or closed data. And I think that one of my main goals is kind of giving legitimacy back to community data as this source of, like, sense making and evidence for policy making. And I think that one thing that community and data stewardship needs more generally is kind of creating more examples of different kinds of use cases, and scenarios where data is working for the benefit of people. And hopefully, in the process of documenting our process with the community data hubs and co-creation with the community partner, we can provide another example that'll just, if somebody comes upon this, they can kind of build on that work, and allow people to really understand what governance mechanisms might work for them. And so, one community or one, group might not need a whole hub structure, but they might need a set of data standards or a workshop on metadata. And so it can kind of, hopefully, my goal is that, it will help communities from a bottom-up way kind of understand, like, what their assets are and, like, what their needs are, and kind of what is incentivizing different, stakeholders within their community to act in different ways with their data. So while a lot of our recommendations kind of work from the top down level, my hope is that, community data hubs is kind of filling in that gap and addressing it from, like, more of a bottom up level.
Yeah, no, that's also really important, because I mean, like, top down can kind of be, I I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like much more of a slower process at times than, like, working directly with the communities that, this would ultimately affect the most. And it makes, like, the most impact, I guess, that is, like, not having to work around all of the, um I don't know what the word I'm trying to use is. I do also want to, I guess, like, go into what exactly community data hubs are for some people that may not be more familiar with that.
Yeah, totally. So in layman's terms, community data hubs will be modeling a networked infrastructure for a way that community environmental data can be stored and shared both with other communities and with researchers and with government. So what that will look like is, a data repository platform alongside, a content library where there's going to be a resource library that will hopefully have, different kinds of tools that communities can use, like data sharing agreements or, how to value your data or here are funding sources. So both having that plus a data repository and a sharing schema that allows for communities to, have different kinds of permissions and protections on the data that they both choose to share or choose to manage in their own way. So it's both designing the hub structure of one hub, but also how the different hubs could communicate with one another.
Yeah, and the way you, I guess, like design how these are, like, I guess, operating is, I'm not sure if these are related, but you guys also have another initiative called like Remix workshops, where I guess like you invite people to workshop these models. So I guess like could we go into that as well?
Yeah. Katie, do you want to talk about
Yeah. Maybe I'll just start from the beginning, which is what the workshops were. We planned a series of 3 workshops earlier this year, and the original purpose was to take an existing data set that was held by different entities and invite people who were actually either part of the collection effort or using the data in that specific data set, and talk about how the data set might be managed, shared, et cetera, differently in ways that would make them more useful to the collectors and other people who wanted to use the data. So the first one was with Center for Neighborhood Technology, or CNT. They're in Chicago, and they had a set of images that they had worked with people in a neighborhood, I think in the south side of Chicago, where they asked residents to take photos of standing water after storms. And the intent there was to communicate with local agencies where flooding was happening and the kinds of impacts that it was having on people's lives. And so the data in that case was these set of images. The policy change was updates to infrastructure or transportation or whatever it was. And so in that specific instance, a community data hub might be really helpful in facilitating the sharing of that information with a local planning district. There are also, kind of tricky questions around privacy. That most of the photos, in fact, maybe all of the photos were taken in public areas, but a lot of the impacts happen in the privacy of someone's own home. Maybe your basement is flooding. But that data, those images, people don't want to share publicly. They might not even want to share them with a public agency. And so how do we transmit that information in ways that is going to be helpful to the people who are being impacted by storms and infrastructure, to the people who can do something to the infrastructure, to the people in government. So that was the first one. Super interesting conversations. The second one was with the California State Water Resources Control Board. It's a mouthful, but we could just call them the water boards for short. But they have lots of data. In the state of California, they're mandated to share most, if not all, of the data that they are collecting. But the data set that we focused on for this specific workshop was drinking water, and the kinds of violations that were made against drinking water policies in California, as well as data like which water systems were applying for funding to update water infrastructure. And who was actually getting that, where were the gaps, and that kind of thing. So really interesting questions around how do we support communities and water systems that need to be updated? What can we do with drinking water data? There were people from, researchers from UC Berkeley to nonprofits from the Central Valley to lawyers who were, working on litigation efforts. So that was a really interesting conversation as well. And for those two workshops, we have been working on a set of recommendations that we can give back to CNT and the water boards about how they can actually change their practices. I'm going to let Emelia explain the last one because the last workshop was a little bit different. But in general, the idea was how can we bring people together who are using data with people who are storing the data and figure out how we can make the system work for everybody.
Yeah, and the last one was a little bit different. We worked in partnership with an organization called Open Team, which works with agricultural data or agricultural tools for open data within the agricultural sector. And so they are developing a data governance tool called the Ag Data Wallet. And we kind of, in this remix workshop, placed both the Ag Data Wallet and community data hubs kind of side by side and thought about, what are the design considerations that really enable ethical data reuse within both of those contexts. And held a little panel interview and then had a breakout sessions. But I think the most interesting piece about that part that remix workshop is that, the Ag Data Wallet and Open Teams is in a different stage of their process of development, and they also have just different capacity and different resources. And so thinking about, what does it look like to develop a data governance tool in different kind of contexts and scenarios was, I think, probably the biggest benefit of that workshop.
Super cool. Yeah, no, I mean, I did kind of pose the question weirdly, I guess. But there is definitely a connection there then for sure. And that's really awesome that I guess because this design you need to source different knowledges and perspectives in order to be able to create this thing. And so this is kind of like a really awesome environment that you guys have created.
You didn't word the question poorly. I'm just making connections in my brain, and sometimes they go a little bit more slowly.
Oh no,
but there's definitely a connection between those workshops and data hubs.
Yeah, no, that totally made sense. How did you both come to work at OEDP as a part of the policy team?
You want to go first, Katie?
Okay. Yeah, I can start. Yeah, so I've been with OEDP for maybe a little over a year and a half, maybe a little bit longer. But so my background is actually in environmental science. I went to UCLA and studied environmental science there. And then studied environmental science as it related to agriculture in grad school. So I had that kind of background. I did a little bit of policy work in grad school too, mostly around kind of carbon accounting, trying to understand how carbon offset policies were being implemented, if they were effective, how people were actually responding to them, and developing protocols for verifying carbon offsets. The long story short, for carbon offsets, is as maybe you are as well, I'm very skeptical of them. But it was a really interesting process of learning how to do carbon accounting. I did some carbon accounting for California almonds when I was in grad school, which is a fascinating and massive part of our agricultural industry in this state. And then after that, I actually I worked at a research center at UC Berkeley managing an open science initiative. So before then, I actually didn't really know what open science was, and kind of fell into this job because it was related to international development and I was interested in that. But spent about 5 years there and became for lack of a better term, I drank the Kool-Aid. I am fully into open science now. I think I was always really interested in the idea that knowledge can be a public good. That was like a concept I learned in undergrad, but didn't really understand what that actually looked like. And then when I started working for BITS, it was the Berkeley Initiative for Transparency in the Social Sciences. We were really focused on academic social science. And so I got really into the details of open science in that very specific world. a lot of that was to do with how do you make your data analysis reproducible so that someone else can do it and build on it, check it, etc. How do you share data? But I missed environmental science. I missed agricultural science. I think, as a lot of us have been realizing over the past decade or so, maybe one of the reasons your podcast exists, we're in a climate crisis. And so felt like I needed to do something a little bit closer to that. And as luck would have it, just kind of stumbled upon the OEDP position and was like, this is kind of amazing that this position exists. I'm gonna try to do this. Yeah, so that's my story.
That's super cool.
Yeah. I feel like, yeah, I think similarly non-linear trajectories, like Katie. Yeah, I similarly did environmental science in undergrad, along with international relations. And so always kind of had my eye on what science, what environmental science, what the climate crisis looks like on an international scope. And so worked on different environmental projects in the Puget Sound and urban ag, and as well as like experimental outdoor education for kids around environmental science. And so, but then wanted a little bit more policy, and so got a grad degree in environmental and climate policy on the international level, but graduated into the pandemic, and so all kind of international pursuits were put on hold, and that's when I found OEDP. So I started, which was really great because I think anything that's interesting like and complex on the international level is also just as interesting and complex on the US domestic level. And so started out at OEDP as a fellow, working on more of the, what it looks like to involve environmental data in the congressional record side of things, in a project that we've since sunsetted. But yeah, worked as a fellow, did a lot of writing and research for OEDP, and then came on full-time in the fall of 2021. And since then, yeah, I think OEDP has really scratched the itch for me of, I think I made an error in thinking that all of the important work to be done was on the policy level at a really big level, at a huge institutional level, right? Like I was like, oh, I want to be a part of, UN climate conversations, and like that's where things are happening. And it's like, I think OEDP really like helped me reframe something that I already knew, back, right after undergrad, and that actually a lot of the real power that's happening in the environmental and climate justice space is with communities. And that's where real change is going to happen. And that's how change kind of can amplify and go up. And so, yeah, that's what led me here and led me to OEDP.
That's really awesome. Yeah, no, I mean, environmental science is definitely something that I'm interested in, and I've like thought about how I could really make an impact. And so like definitely I've thought about like which part of policy would make sense for that. And I mean, like the journeys that you two have gone on, that's really that's got me thinking. That's really cool. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, I guess like I do also want to ask, like at this stage, what is some advice that I guess you would give to someone that's like interested in starting or pursuing environmental work or education?
Good question. Do you want to start, Amelia?
Yeah, I can. I think that some advice that I recently finished a fellowship with the Civic Science Network with the Rita Allen Foundation. And I think that one thing that I really thought about through that fellowship was that, when you're working in these fields around climate or even environmental work, a lot of the career trajectories that the three of us will have just haven't existed yet, because all of these climate problems and a lot of these environmental problems, while some of the environmental problems are not new, but just complexifying, but the climate problem is new, right? And it's going to look different in the next decade. It's going to look different when we all retire, right? And so just being okay with that uncertainty and like knowing that, maybe there's not somebody at the mid stage of their career, at the end stage of the career that I really can like point to and be like, oh, that's what I want. But just knowing that like the next step that I take is the next step that makes sense for me or makes sense for like how I see my purpose in this larger, climate fight. And I think also just, I think within climate and environmental, there's so many paths you can take. You kind of mentioned that. And at the beginning of my career, I think one of my professors just told me to do one thing, and that will lead to the next thing. You don't have to be paralyzed and think like, how can I do the most, with my career. It's like, it will all shake out. Just like start with 1 foot forward, and that will lead to the next thing, lead to the next thing.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. I also think like the conversation around climate action, climate justice, environmental justice, it's changing all the time. The more voice we give to different people, the more expansive this conversation is going to be, and that can make things really tricky. And it's also really important for that to happen. So I guess to like reinforce Emilia's point about like I think it's totally fine to start with one thing and see where that leads you, and also be open to, where it's going to take you, because it's probably going to take you in a lot of different directions if you're really interested in meaningful change. The other thing I would say, and Amelia kind of mentioned something like this a little bit earlier, but I think I was also of the impression that I needed to do things on like a global scale. I needed to work for the UN. I did like a study abroad thing where I was like, this is how I'm going to get into the UN with this study abroad program. And it's not to say that the UN isn't important, but I think that there are so many, no matter where you are in the world, there are going to be important environmental and climate justice issues anywhere. And I wish that I had, it's not that I didn't pay attention to that kind of thing, but I didn't put as much of an emphasis on it as I wish I had when I was younger. And I'm from California. I mean, not that California has worse problems anywhere else, but we have like very visible environmental problems. And I think I started coming to that realization as I got older. But like, if you are, international multilateral climate policy is critical, and you can do things in your hometown. And it's going to make you feel much better about where you are. It's going to give you a better sense of purpose, and it's going to help you, stay in this kind of career path for longer if you feel like you're doing something that you can see the impact of. Because trying to do things on a global scale all the time,
it's quite detached.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, to build off of Katie's point, it's just that so much in the environmental field and just like environmental governance and history is connected. So like, you'll think that you're doing one job and that will lead in one trajectory, and that you'll be kind of like in that, that lane, but then that lane connects to so many other lanes. So like, I think about, your trajectory, Katie, of kind of like working in ag and carbon accounting, and like how that like has circled back, and now you can use that experience to like think about that kind of data at OEDP, and like lessons from like my work with, educational, like teaching kids about salmon in the Puget Sound. Like I think about that work in terms of like open science and open data. So it all circles around. It's all holistic. It's all connected.
Yeah, no, that's so true. Like, I mean, with something like climate work, it's so big and broad because this is like a global issue anyways. It's like, it's inevitable that it's gonna be something interdisciplinary that you're gonna be doing if you do this. Yeah, that's really great advice. Thank you for that. Yeah, I guess to kind of close off, what are some, I guess, like OEDP resources that listeners interested in working with environmental data can access and utilize?
Yeah, well, if you like podcasts, Amelia mentioned this earlier, but we do have a podcast. We've got 2 seasons.
Podcast.
Thank you. We neither Amelia or I led it, but we've gotten to get our hands in it a little bit. Amelia a little bit more than I have, but yeah, our colleague Michelle, and for this recent season, a fellow named Madhuri Karak led that season, and it's awesome. So that's like, if you want the audio narrative, that's a really great way to see how some of the issues that we talk about in our other work kind of play out in different real world scenarios. Also, if you go on our website, openenvironmentaldata.org, we try to post all of the things that we create. Open is in our name, so we try to be as open as possible, but you can find briefs that we've written, You can find information about workshops that we've had in the past, what's coming up. Emelia last year worked on something called a design brief, which, you know, kind of maybe not exactly the same as a podcast, but like tried to take a idea or a set of ideas that we talked about in a research setting and see what those looked like in a design setting. You know, how might we design this thing to actually fit in a specific community or neighborhood? Yeah. What other things should we highlight from stuff that's on the website?
Well, there's the digital rights briefs if people are interested in digital rights. So I think we have links to those work we did with the Engine Room and the Ford Foundation last year on environmental justice, climate justice, open knowledge in terms of in digital rights context. Yeah, I think you pretty much hit on everything.
There's hopefully a lot more to come. A lot of the work that both Emelia and I do, we're starting to think about designing resources. So there's a lot of stuff on the website already, but over the next year, 2 or 3, I think you can expect a lot more, especially around like curriculum and, you know, these tools that Emelia was mentioning earlier, data use agreements, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's super awesome. I'll be sure to, I guess, like link every resource that's been mentioned. And I mean, I've explored the website myself. It's a lot of interesting. It's quite like surprisingly digestible. Like all of this data stuff is very new to me. So like I had like no idea what I was going into, but it was like it made sense. It was really interesting to read about. You know, I highly recommend it. Yeah,
it's really good to know.
no, for sure. But yeah, I mean, thank you so much, the two of you, for taking the time to speak with me today. I've really learned a lot from this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. This was really fun.
That's really fun.